Imagine sitting at the live poker table and just watching your stack grow without you ever having to do anything fancy. Well, this is exactly what we are going to talk about today. After having played live poker successfully for about a decade, I have come across all sorts of recreational players and I have learned some methods to crush players at 1-2 and 1-3 live. In this video, we are going to talk about what mistakes they tend to make and how we can take advantage of them. These 4 trusted and tested tips will set you up to become a comfortable winner in the low-stakes games. Especially the last tip can add quite a bit to your win rate, but it is such an overlooked concept, so make sure to watch until the end. The first hack to win more against recreational players is closely connected to the biggest mistake recreational poker players make. Any idea what that mistake is? Well, almost all recreational players in the world, no matter what stakes they play, no matter whether they play cash games or tournaments, the one thing they have in common is they play way too many hands. Whether they limp a7 offsuit or call a 3-bet out of position with king 10 offsuit, they play a lot more hands than solvers would recommend. So we have to find a way to exploit this. Obviously, one of the best ways to do that is to play strong ranges ourselves. But this is only part of the equation. I don't want to get too technical about this, but you might have heard of the concept of range advantage. Range advantage refers to a situation where one player's potential range of hands is statistically stronger than the opponent's range of hands in a given situation. And yes, I realize that most recreational players don't care about range advantage, but that doesn't mean that you should ignore it. In fact, theory dictates that whenever you have a significant range advantage, you should bet. And now imagine a player who reaches the flop with a much wider range than he is supposed to have. What does that mean? Well, it means that he will connect a lot worse with a random flop than theory would assume. Here's an example. This is what a solver would typically call in the big blind against a middle position open. On a random flop of 9-5 deuce rainbow, around 37% of hands have at least a pair or a gut shot on this flop. Everything else is basically junk. But now, let's look at what a typical recreational player calls with in the same spot. It is a much wider range consisting of basically any suited king, any suited queen, lots of offsuit connected hands like Jack 9, Jack 8, 10 8, and some random suited hands like Jack 6. This range now connects a lot worse with this flop. Only 29% of hands have at least a gut shot or a pair. So how can we take advantage of this? Exploit number 1 is we can continuation bet pretty much our entire range because villain has a lot of junk in their range. You might now say,
"But Andreas, my opponents never fold a pair or a gut shot."
Well, that's fine. As we said, only 29% of hands connect with this flop. We don't need them to fold a pair, but if they fold all or at least most of their junk, we print money with this bet, even if they will obviously still continue about a third of the time. The second exploit is my favorite one. This one works best in 3-bet pots and against somewhat nitty opponents, but don't try this in Texas or Florida, where people tend to call you down with any pair. But against any opponent who is a bit nittier than that, this one works wonders. And it builds on exploit number 1. In the previous example, we assumed that villain will fold anything that won't connect with a flop. But maybe that was a bit too optimistic. A lot of your recreational villains will still call with ace high, maybe even king high. So they will still show up on the turn with a lot of junk. And even bottom pair or a weak pocket pair won't be an amazing hand by the turn. So here is the actual magic. Exploit number 2 is, if you don't have any showdown value, just barrel the turn. Ideally, barrel quite big. Even a bet that's bigger than the pot could be useful. If villain sits there with ace high or pocket 4s, he will have a very hard time calling. For exploit number 3, we're moving on from bluffs to value hands. But let's say we don't have a massive value hand, but more of a mediocre made hand, like in this example. Let's say we raise in middle position with ace-4 of spades, a recreational player in the big blind calls. The flop comes ace-jack-6 with 2 hearts. This is a somewhat wet board, so many players would want to bet for protection. But you don't really need to protect, or I should rather say you can't protect. Because if he has a flush draw, he will never fold it. And if he has a gut shot, then he has an 8% chance to improve to a straight on the turn, which is a risk I'm willing to take. Against this type of player, I would check this marginal made hand. The reason is that he will tell you on the turn with his action and potential bet sizing if he has anything. If he has a weak ace or even a jack and sometimes a hand like pocket sevens, he will bet the turn because he is afraid of a flush coming. Also, he might just bluff with complete air and then you can bluff catch. You might now say,
But Andreas, in my games, players never bluff.
well, I don't think that is really true. But one thing is true. In live poker, recreational players rarely bluff for a lot of money. So if you see a bet for over $100 at 1-2 or 1-3, then this is much more likely to be for value. And that's exactly why I would check back the flop in our example. Tip number 3 is we check for information because our villain will reveal a lot about his hand if we check. And now on to tip number 4, the one that can really determine whether you're just a small winner or a crusher. Here's an example to show you what most decent live regs do. They raise a hand like King-Jack and they get called by the 2 players in the blinds. The flop comes ace-queen-deuce with 2 hearts. Hero makes a continuation bet, the small blind folds, the big blind calls. He now hits the gin card on the turn. The offsuit 10 gives Hero the nuts. He makes a 2/3 pot bet and gets called again. The river is a total brick. Hero now panics that the opponent might have a missed flush draw, so he bets about half pot. Villain snap calls with ace-jack. The thing is, if Villain had a flush draw, then you can bet $5 and he will probably fold. So don't worry about that. You have to try to maximize against his big hands. And yes, I agree that he probably won't have a set and maybe not even 2 pair because he would have probably raised at some point. But recreational players are often inelastic to bet sizing. They either believe you or they don't. And if they think that you have a missed flush draw, then they will call you down no matter what. If you are super deep, then maybe you can't go all in. But if you're 100 or 150 big blinds deep, you can just shove for value in this spot. So tip number 4 is make sure you get the maximum. Exploiting recreational players is only half of what you have to do in order to maximize your winnings though. There are 3 more things that you must consider. To find out what they are, click on this video here.